It was a gray morning in a small town outside Atlanta, where the air always seemed to hold a faint heaviness, like the world hadn't quite woken up yet. The streets were damp from last night's rain, and puddles shimmered faintly under the flickering light of an old. The town wasn't rich, but it wasn't poor either. It was one of those in-between places where people worked hard enough to survive, but not enough to escape. On Main Street, the heart of that quiet town, stood an aging brick bank with its white paint peeling from the pillars, and its sign slightly crooked from years of storms and neglect. That morning a woman appeared outside the bank. Her coat was tattered, the edges frayed like she'd owned it for decades. Her gray hair peeked from under a faded scarf, and her shoes looked too thin for the cold ground beneath her. She held a small plastic bag with all her belongings, a few papers, some old receipts, maybe a snack she'd saved. People walking by barely noticed her, and those who did glanced away, uncomfortable with the sight of poverty so close to their comfort. To them, she was just another homeless woman, someone whose story wasn't worth knowing. Inside the bank, warmth met the sound of quiet chatter and the faint click of keyboards. The employees were young, too young maybe, to understand the kind of struggle that clings to you for a lifetime. They talked about their weekend plans and rolled their eyes at customers who took too long. Behind the counter, the manager, a man in his mid-30s named Brent, adjusted his tie and checked his reflection in the glass door. He liked to believe he was a good man, fair, respected. But beneath his calm tone was a sharp pride, one that made him see people as categories, customers who mattered and those who didn't. When the door opened and the old woman stepped inside, the quiet hum of the bank changed. The scent of rain and old fabric followed her in, mixing with the smell of polished floors and coffee. For a moment the tellers exchanged glances, silent judgments in the form of small smirks. One whispered something to another who stifled a laugh. Brent noticed too. He looked up from his desk, his expression tightening as if the woman's presence had thrown the balance of his clean, organized world. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, forcing a polite smile. The woman nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'd like to make a withdrawal." The tellers blinked at each other, trying not to laugh. The words sounded strange coming from someone dressed like her. One of them, a young woman with bright nails and a fake smile, asked, "From which account, ma'am?" Her tone was light, but there was mockery in it, hidden beneath the surface. The old woman reached into her bag, her trembling hands pulling out a folded paper that looked worn from time and touch. She slid it across the counter carefully, almost reverently. "From this one," she said softly. The teller hesitated, her smile fading a little as she unfolded the document. The paper looked old, too old to be real, she thought, probably something the woman had found or made up. "I'm sorry," the teller said, trying to sound patient. "This isn't a valid account number anymore. Maybe you meant to go to the government office down the road." But the woman didn't move. She looked at the teller with tired eyes that had seen too much. "No," she said simply. "This is my account. I opened it here a long time ago." Brent walked over, his voice sharp but controlled. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we can't process outdated paperwork. Maybe we can help you find the right place." She nodded faintly, as if she'd expected it. Her eyes drifted to the floor, and for a moment no one said anything. Then, as she turned to leave, one of the younger employees snickered. It was small, quick, but loud enough to echo through the silence that followed. The others tried to suppress their laughter, but once it started, it spread like a quiet, cruel wave. Even Brent couldn't stop the small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The woman didn't say a word. She simply looked around the room once more, her gaze lingering on each face as if memorizing them. Her eyes were calm, too calm. Then she nodded slightly, as though she understood something they didn't. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her slow footsteps fading into the rain. What none of them knew was that the woman wasn't who she seemed. Beneath the worn clothes, behind those quiet eyes, was someone far different, someone who had once owned the very walls that surrounded them. The bank they worked in, the land beneath their homes, even the town's first hospital, all of it had once belonged to her. But time has a way of stripping people down until they're invisible. And as the doors closed behind her, the laughter still echoing inside, no one realized they had just mocked the one person who held more power than all of them combined. Outside, the rain began to pour harder, washing over the sidewalks and filling the cracks between the stones. The woman walked slowly toward a bus stop, her coat clinging to her shoulders, her bag pressed close to her chest. The world had decided she was nobody, and she had let it, for now. Inside the bank, the laughter faded into the usual rhythm of clicking keyboards and routine. But somewhere deep in the quiet corners of that morning, something had shifted. A fragile normal had been disturbed. And though no one could see it yet, the balance of power in that small town was about to change forever. The rain didn't stop that week. It fell every night, filling the gutters and turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected a tired, gray sky. The bank stayed busy, its warm lights glowing like a false promise against the cold outside. But something inside those walls had changed since that morning. Nobody said it aloud, but every time the door opened, a few of them turned, expecting to see the old woman again. Her silence had left a mark, like a question no one wanted to answer. Brent tried to forget it. He had more important things to think about: his upcoming promotion, the regional audit, the constant pressure from corporate. Still, he found himself thinking about her sometimes. The way she had looked at him, calm and steady even as people laughed. It had unsettled him, not because she was homeless or strange, but because she hadn't seemed afraid. She hadn't looked like someone begging for help. She had looked like someone watching. The tellers, though, made a joke of it. At lunch, they'd imitate her quiet voice, holding up fake slips of paper and saying, "I'd like to make a withdrawal." They laughed until their eyes watered, never realizing that their laughter was being noticed by the wrong people. One of those people was a janitor named, a quiet man who worked the late shift. He was in his 60s with calloused hands and a limp from a factory accident years ago. Nobody paid much attention to him, which meant he heard everything, and knew that the homeless woman wasn't just anybody. He'd seen her before years back when she used to walk into the bank through the back door, not the front. Back then, everyone had called her Ms. She had been a legend in town once, a businesswoman, sharp and generous, who had built most of what people now took for granted. Her family's company owned the land under half the businesses on Main Street, including the bank. But when she grew older, things began to fall apart. Her only son had taken control of her finances, promising to modernize everything. Instead, he'd sold off her properties one by one, gambling the profits away until there was nothing left. Rumor was he disappeared after that. Some said he moved to Florida. Others whispered he'd been found dead in a motel years later. No one really knew. But remembered her face, and when he saw her standing there that morning, he had almost spoken up. Almost, but fear had stopped him. Nobody believed a janitor when he spoke of powerful people. A few days after her visit, things began to go wrong at the bank. Small things at first. A computer glitch erased part of the customer transaction history. The system logged in a new account under a name no one recognized: Enterprises. Brent dismissed it as an error, but he felt something uneasy deep down. Then came the phone calls, strange, silent ones that always came late at night to the bank's main office. When employees answered, there was only breathing on the other end. The tellers joked that the crazy old lady was haunting them, but Brent didn't laugh. He ordered the IT team to look into it, but they found nothing. Around that time, a reporter from the local paper, a woman named, began asking questions about the bank's ownership history. She had a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for stories that hid behind polite smiles. When she came to interview Brent, he grew defensive. She told him she'd been digging through old property records and found something odd. The original deed to the bank still listed Holdings as part owner. That name hadn't been mentioned in decades. Brent tried to brush it off but wasn't easily fooled. "You know," she said quietly, "people talk. They say the family built this town and that somebody took everything from them." Her eyes lingered on him before she left, and for the first time in a long while, Brent felt small. That night he couldn't sleep. His wife noticed. "You've been acting strange lately," she said softly. "Is something wrong at work?" He told her about the old woman, how she'd come in, how everyone had laughed. Didn't laugh. Instead, she stared at him in silence. "You shouldn't have done that," she said finally. "You never know who people really are." The next morning, when Brent arrived at the bank, he found a letter waiting on his desk. It wasn't signed, but it was neatly folded and written in clean handwriting. "Sometimes the ones you look down on are the ones you should have looked up to. You'll understand soon." Brent's hands trembled as he read it. He crumpled the paper and threw it away, but the words burned in his mind. As the days went by, the tension among the staff grew. The jokes stopped. The laughter faded. Everyone could feel something coming, though no one could explain it. Strange people started visiting the bank, older men in suits who spoke quietly with Brent behind closed doors. They claimed to be investors, but overheard enough to know they were. They were lawyers. And they had come for the truth. Apparently, the old woman, Ms., had filed a legal claim. She was trying to reclaim ownership of the bank. Most employees thought it was a delusion, but the lawyers didn't. They said the paperwork she'd provided was authentic, dating back decades. The deed she'd shown that day wasn't a fantasy, it was evidence. For Brent, everything began to unravel. If the case went public, his job, his reputation, everything he'd built would be destroyed. He had used his position for years to gain favors, small bribes, under-the-table deals that had kept him comfortable. If the bank's past ownership came under investigation, so would he. He began working late, his mind racing, hands shaking. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. His wife noticed the change, but he refused to talk about it. "It's nothing," he kept saying, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Then something happened that broke the fragile calm. One night, a fire alarm went off at the bank around midnight. The fire department arrived quickly, finding smoke pouring from the records room. Most of the damage was minor, but the paper archives, the ones that contained the old deeds and historical contracts, were destroyed completely. Brent said it was an electrical fault. Everyone believed him, everyone except. The janitor had been there that night, mopping floors in the back hallway. He'd seen Brent leaving just minutes before the alarm went off, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face pale. He knew what that meant, but he said nothing. People like him didn't speak against people like Brent. A week later, Ms. returned. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, like someone who had already seen the ending. She walked up to the counter quietly, and this time no one laughed. Brent came out of his office, his hands tight at his sides. "Ms.," he said stiffly, "I heard you filed a claim, I don't think." She interrupted him gently. "I didn't come here for your opinion." The air felt thick. Everyone in the lobby stopped pretending to work. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on for a moment, and he gave a small nod, an acknowledgement between two people who understood too much. Then she turned back to Brent. "You burn the past," she said softly, "but not everything worth keeping lives on paper." Brent felt a chill run through him. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," she whispered, "and soon so will everyone else." That night, Brent drove to her shelter. He waited outside in his car, staring at the dim light in the window where she slept. His chest ached with panic. Everything he'd worked for was slipping away because of her. Because of a woman the world had decided didn't matter. He didn't know what he was capable of, not yet. But as the rain began again, and her shadow moved past the window, something inside him broke, a quiet snap that no one could hear. The town's fragile peace was ending. The lines between guilt and survival, pride and shame had begun to blur. And as the storm thickened over Main Street, every person tied to the bank, Brent, even Ms., felt the same thing deep inside, that something irreversible was coming. Something that would turn their quiet lives into a story the town would whisper about for years. The night it happened, the rain came harder than it had all season. It hit the rooftops in steady sheets, sliding down gutters like thin streams of silver. The streets were empty, washed clean of sound except for the faint buzz of streetlights and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. Inside the town's old community shelter, where the walls were cracked and the air always smelled faintly of mildew, Ms. sat on her cot, quietly folding a letter she had just written. It was short, only a few lines, but every word carried the weight of decades. She was writing to her late son, or maybe to herself. No one really knew anymore. "I forgive you," it said, "and I forgive the M too, but they must see." She looked tired that night, but not defeated. Her eyes had the steady calm of someone who had already made peace with what was coming. The old brass clock on the wall ticked slowly, its rhythm blending with the steady beat of rain on the tin roof. Outside, a car idled in the distance. The headlights cut through the fog like twin blades of white, stopping just short of the shelter. Brent sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His suit jacket was damp from the rain, his tie loosened. His mind was a storm of noise, anger, fear, guilt, and desperation, all tangled into one choking mass. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. When he started digging through the bank's old records, he only wanted to protect himself. But every paper he found pointed to the same thing. Ms. had proof that could destroy him, and not just him, the entire management of the bank. The lawyers had told him quietly that she wouldn't back down. She wanted everything restored, every wrong corrected. And when she won, they said, people like him would be left with nothing. He couldn't let that happen, not after everything he'd worked for. He told himself this was about survival. He told himself she was old, confused, probably not even aware of what her accusations could do. He repeated those lies until he half believed them. But deep down, under the weight of his justifications, he knew he was about to cross a line he could never return from. He got out of the car and walked toward the shelter. The rain was cold, cutting against his skin, soaking through his shirt. His shoes splashed through puddles as thunder rolled overhead. The shelter door creaked when he opened it. Inside, only a few dim lights were on. Most of the residents were asleep, curled under thin blankets. The air was heavy and still. He spotted her at the far end of the room, sitting upright on her cot, her bag beside her. She looked up when she heard him. "Mr. Brent," she said quietly, as if she had expected him. He froze, startled that she knew his name. "You remember me," he said after a moment. His voice trembled. "I remember your face," she said. "You were the one who laughed." He felt something twist inside him. "It wasn't like that. You don't understand." "I understand enough," she interrupted gently. "You burned the truth. You thought you could hide it, but the truth always has a way of returning." Her calmness made him angry. It felt like she was still in control, still holding power over him even here in her worn-out clothes and broken surroundings. "You're ruining people's lives," he snapped. "Do you know what you've done? You think dragging up old papers makes you right, that you can take back everything after all these years." She looked at him steadily, her eyes soft but unyielding. "I'm not taking anything," she said. "I'm just reclaiming what was mine, what my family built before men like you took it." Her words cut deep, sharper than she could have known. He stepped closer, his hands shaking. "You don't know what I've sacrificed for that bank. Everything I have, I earned. You're just living in the past." "Then let me live there," she whispered. "It's all I have left." Something in him snapped. It was quick, almost unnoticeable, like a string pulled too tight that finally gives way. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. She gasped, struggling to pull free, but he was stronger. The bag she'd kept beside her fell open, scattering its contents. Old letters, faded documents, the deed with her family's name still visible. He saw it, that name, Holdings, and it set fire to whatever was left of his reason. "You don't deserve this," he shouted, his voice low but shaking. "You're nothing now. You think anyone cares who you used to be." Her voice broke, not in fear but in sorrow. "You've already lost, Brent. Not your job, not your name, something worse." He didn't think, he couldn't. His hand closed around her throat. Her eyes widened, not in terror, but in something else, sadness, maybe, or pity. She tried to speak, to say something, but no sound came out. The rain outside thundered louder, the world drowning in noise as her frail hands clawed weakly at his wrists. For a brief moment he saw himself reflected in her eyes, saw the man he had become, not the one he thought he was. But the vision vanished as quickly as it came. When her body went limp, he stepped back, gasping for air, the reality of what he'd done crashing over him. The shelter was silent. The clock on the wall ticked on as if nothing had changed. Somewhere a pipe dripped. Brent dropped to his knees, shaking. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, what have I done?" Her papers were scattered across the floor, soaked from the rain that blew in through the open door. He stared at the name printed in bold, black ink, Holdings, mocking him. He grabbed the papers and stuffed them into his coat, trying to erase any sign of what she had been fighting for. He looked around wildly. No one had seen, no one had heard. He told himself it was an accident. She had fallen. He'd only meant to stop her, but deep down he knew the truth. He had killed her. He dragged her body to the back hallway, near the boiler room, where no one would notice right away. His hands trembled as he wiped the doorknob clean, his mind racing through a dozen plans that all ended the same way, with him caught. He returned to his car, soaked and shaking. The storm was easing now, the thunder fading into distant rumbles. He sat there for a long time, staring through the windshield as the rain slowed to a drizzle. When he finally drove away, he didn't see standing under the awning across the street. The janitor had seen him go in. He had seen him come out, and he had seen enough to know what had happened inside. Didn't move for a long time. The night air was cold, and his heart felt heavier than it had in years. He had known Ms. once as a woman of pride and fire. To see her end this way, alone, forgotten, at the hands of a man who once laughed at her, filled him with a quiet, steady rage. Inside the shelter, the sound of the clock kept ticking, echoing through the still air. The letter she had written lay crumpled beside her cot, the ink smudged from the rain. It was addressed to no one, yet somehow it was meant for everyone. By morning, the storm had passed. The town woke to the smell of wet earth and coffee brewing in tired kitchens. The bank opened as usual. Brent arrived on time, his shirt pressed, his face calm. No one noticed the faint red marks on his wrist. No one noticed the tremor in his hand when he poured his coffee. But he noticed everything, every sound, every glance. He felt the weight of what he'd done sitting behind his ribs, heavy and cold. And when the police cars drove past the bank later that afternoon, sirens quiet, lights flashing, he didn't have to ask where they were going. He already knew. And though he kept his face steady as his employees watched from the windows, something inside him cracked again, small, quiet, and final. Because even before anyone spoke a word, he understood what Ms. had meant that night. He had already lost. The morning after the storm, the town seemed quieter than usual. The sky was washed pale blue, and the streets glistened from the night's heavy rain. But beneath the calm surface, something dark had settled. A silence that didn't feel peaceful but heavy, like the town itself knew something was wrong. It was who made the call. He didn't say much, just that there was something wrong at the shelter. When the police arrived, they found Ms.'s body near the boiler room. Her face was peaceful, her hands resting on her chest. There were faint marks on her neck, barely visible, but enough for the detectives to understand that she hadn't died on her own. The letter beside her was smudged from rainwater, but one line was still clear. The truth always finds a way home. News traveled fast. By noon, the shelter was surrounded by police tape and reporters. People whispered outside, some pretending to care, others just wanting to know what had happened. Most of them hadn't even known her name until that day. Brent heard the news while sitting in his office. One of the tellers, her voice shaking, said, "They found that old woman from last week, the homeless one. She's dead." The world seemed to freeze for a moment. He forced himself to look surprised, even shocked, but his heart was pounding so loudly he thought everyone could hear it. "That's awful," he said softly, keeping his face steady. "Did they say how?" "No," the teller said, "just that it looks suspicious." He nodded, pretending to think, pretending to care, pretending to be the kind of man who hadn't been there. But inside, his thoughts were spinning too fast to hold onto. Every sound, the clicking of keyboards, the hum of the air conditioner, sounded sharper, closer. He could feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck, and every time someone looked his way, he was sure they knew. That night he didn't go home. He drove aimlessly, circling the same few streets until his gas light came on. His wife called 3 times, then stopped. When he finally did return home, she was waiting in the living room, her eyes red from crying. "They're saying it was murder," she said quietly. "That woman from the bank." He sat down heavily, unable to look at her. "Don't believe everything you hear," he muttered. But she kept watching him. "Brent," she said softly, "you've been acting strange for weeks. I know you were involved somehow. Just tell me the truth." He looked up then, eyes bloodshot. "You don't know what it's like," he said. "To work your whole life and have it ripped away by someone who doesn't even matter anymore. I didn't mean for it to happen. I just snapped." Her face went pale. She stood slowly like she was afraid of him. "You killed her," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to," he stopped himself, realizing too late that every word made it worse. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I was trying to protect us," he said weakly. "Protect us," she said, her voice trembling. "You've destroyed everything." She left that night, taking only her purse and a coat. He didn't stop her. The next morning, the police arrived at his office. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They asked him to come down to the station just for a few questions. He agreed, his voice hollow, his body heavy. But when he stood, he saw standing in the lobby, watching from a distance. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Brent knew. Had told them. At the station, the detectives laid out everything. The security camera footage showing his car parked near the shelter, the fingerprints on the door handle, the fibers from his jacket found on her sleeve. The evidence was small but enough. He didn't deny it. There was no point. He broke down during questioning, sobbing as he tried to explain himself. "She was going to ruin me," he said again and again. "She wanted to take everything. I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted her to stop." The detective, a tired man who had seen too much of this kind of thing, leaned back and said quietly, "She wasn't the one who ruined you, Brent. You did that yourself." Word of his arrest spread through town like wildfire. The same people who had once shaken his hand at community events now whispered about him behind closed doors. The same tellers who used to laugh at his jokes avoided saying his name. The news painted him as a man who had let greed and pride consume him, a man who killed to hide his shame. But for others, the story wasn't just about a crime. It was about what the town had become. People began talking about how they'd treated Ms., how they'd ignored her, mocked her, dismissed her as a nobody. The journalist wrote a piece about her legacy, detailing how the family had built the town's first library, hospital, and community center. She included old photos of a younger Ms. standing proudly in front of the bank when it first opened, surrounded by smiling employees. The story broke hearts. It made people realize that the woman they'd walked past for years had once been the backbone of their town, and they'd let her die alone. Attended her funeral. Only a handful of people were there, some from the shelter, a few from the town who felt guilty for not noticing her sooner. The preacher spoke quietly about forgiveness and dignity, about how wealth doesn't define a person's worth. Stood at the back, hat in hand, staring at her small wooden coffin. He thought about all the years she'd been forgotten, and how it took her death for people to remember her name. When he left the cemetery, he felt a strange calm. Maybe justice had come in its own way, not through money or revenge, but through truth finally being seen. As for Brent, jail changed him. In the beginning, he tried to hold on to his pride, telling himself he'd made one mistake in a life full of sacrifices. But guilt doesn't fade easily. It ate at him day by day. He stopped talking, stopped eating much. At night when the lights went out, he'd see her face, the way she looked at him right before it happened. Not angry, not scared, just sad. His wife filed for divorce. The bank erased his name from every document, every plaque. The town moved on, as towns always do, though not without a lingering unease. People spoke of him in hushed tones, as if afraid his story might somehow stain their own lives. But what stayed with everyone wasn't the man who fell. It was the woman they'd all overlooked. Her story spread beyond their town, was shared online, and discussed in small community meetings across the state. She became a symbol of quiet strength, of dignity in the face of cruelty. Years later, the bank was renamed the Trust. A small plaque hung by the entrance, in memory of who gave this town more than it ever gave her. People passed by it every day, most too young to know the full story. But those who did would pause sometimes, tracing the engraved letters with their fingers, remembering the day they'd laughed at a woman who had once owned it all. And somewhere in the stillness of memory, the rain would fall again, soft, unending, washing away the noise of the world that had taken so long to see her. Months passed, but the memory of that day inside the bank never left anyone who had been there. News of the woman's true identity spread like wildfire, first across the small town, then across the state, and soon the entire country knew about the homeless billionaire who had walked into a local bank and been laughed at. The woman everyone had mocked turned out to be Price, one of the wealthiest real estate magnates in the state, who had chosen to live away from the world's noise, testing the humanity she believed was fading from society. What began as a simple act of kindness gone wrong became a national reflection on morality, judgment, and the quiet cruelty people show without even realizing it. The employees who had laughed were suspended within hours of the story breaking. Videos from the bank's security cameras leaked online and the internet erupted. Hashtags like homeless billionaire and kindness test filled social feeds. People debated endlessly, some defending the workers, saying they were only human and made a mistake. Others were outraged, calling for their firing and public apology. But for none of that mattered. The damage was already done, not to her finances or her name, but to her belief in people's hearts. When she finally stepped forward and addressed the media, she did it not with anger, but with calm. Dressed simply in the same worn clothes she had worn that day, she stood outside the bank and spoke softly into a dozen microphones. "Money changes how people treat you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But when you strip it away, you see who they really are. I didn't need their laughter to remind me of my worth, but they needed that moment to remember theirs." The crowd went silent. Cameras flashed, but turned and walked away before anyone could ask questions. That was the last public statement she ever made. For the tellers and manager, life was never the same. The manager, Mr. Bradley, was dismissed after the investigation found that he had not only mocked, but had also authorized her removal from the premises without cause. His reputation was shattered. No other bank would hire him, and his marriage fell apart soon after. He tried to defend himself by saying he thought she was just another person trying to cause trouble. But even he knew that excuse couldn't wash away what people saw on that footage. His smirk, his dismissive tone, his lack of basic respect. Lena, the young teller who had laughed nervously that day, suffered a different kind of punishment. The guilt ate at her. She tried to apologize. She even wrote a letter. "I didn't mean to laugh," she wrote. "I just followed everyone else. I'm sorry I didn't see you as a person." She mailed it to his foundation office, but never got a reply. Still, she kept a copy of that letter taped to her fridge as a reminder of what happens when you lose empathy, even for a moment. Meanwhile, quietly made changes behind the scenes. She donated millions to shelters, built new housing projects under the name Haven for Hope, and ensured that every facility trained staff on treating people with dignity, regardless of appearance or wealth. But she also disappeared from public life completely, refusing interviews, turning down awards, and avoiding cameras. It wasn't about being praised. It was about doing something good in a world that had failed a simple test of kindness. The town that once mocked her soon found itself transformed. Local businesses started community programs for the homeless, schools began lessons on empathy, and the same bank, under new management, started hosting Human Dignity Days, offering meals and job support for those in need. Some said actions had shamed them into changing, others said she had inspired them. Either way, her story forced people to look at themselves differently. Years later, when passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 84, the news stunned the nation once again. Her will revealed something few expected. She had left her entire fortune, nearly $2.7 billion, to charitable foundations, small community banks, and local outreach centers. The same bank where she'd been laughed at received a single dollar along with a handwritten note that read, "Use this to start again with humanity." The story became the subject of countless documentaries and college ethics classes. People debated whether her test was fair, whether it was right to disguise herself to judge others. But those who knew her said it wasn't about judgment. It was about truth. She had lived through poverty before her wealth, had once been turned away from a bank herself decades ago, and never forgot that feeling. Her disguise wasn't revenge. It was a reminder of what she once was and what others failed to see. In the end, everyone connected to that moment was changed forever. Mr. Bradley moved away, living in quiet regret. Lena became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping those society ignored. And the town, once known for its arrogance, became known for its compassion. People stopped walking past the homeless without looking. They stopped assuming worth could be measured by clothes or speech. His name became a quiet legend. Not for her wealth, but for what she revealed about the world. That kindness shouldn't depend on what someone looks like, and respect isn't a privilege, but a duty. Her story wasn't about revenge or redemption, but reflection. A mirror held up to society, showing both its ugliness and its potential to change. In the end, the woman they had laughed at walked away not as a victim, but as a lesson. A reminder that sometimes the richest people are those who see value where others don't, and they are the ones who can't see past their own pride. Justice wasn't served in a courtroom. It was served in the silence that followed her story, in the uncomfortable self-awareness that made people think twice before judging someone again. That was Price's final gift to the world, a test humanity almost failed but never forgot.